Welcome back, beasties. That's what I've decided I'm going to call you all from now on. Sorry. Today, I want to talk to you about one of the most notorious historical cases of man-eating on record. Not a story from Africa or the Indian Sundarbans, but a story from 18th century France about something that may have killed over 100 people and mauled and scarred for life up to 100 more. Not in a single night, not in a single place, but over the course of nearly 3 years. And what makes it so unsettling isn't just the number of deaths, it's that nobody could agree on what was responsible. Some said it was a wolf, others said a hyena. Some believed it was something supernatural. And even now, there isn't a single explanation that fully fits. Or is there? This is the story of the beast of Gévaudan. Before we get into the attacks, you need to understand where this happened. Gévaudan isn't a place you'll find on a modern map. Today, it's mostly the Lozère region in southern France, a landscape of mountains, forests, valleys, and open plateaus. It's beautiful, but harsh. In the 1760s, it was one of the poorest regions in the country. Perhaps Europe. Most people lived in small, scattered hamlets with buildings dispersed and constructed where the landscape allowed. In other words, your neighbours weren't necessarily just next door and might not be able to come running if you were in trouble. Many people at the time couldn't read or write. Families often slept in the same room as their livestock. Life revolved simply around survival. Tending sheep, cattle, and harvesting small crops. Wool was the primary market for the region, and that meant something important. A lot of the day-to-day work, including herding cattle out in open country, was done by women and children. Children as young as 8 or 9, often accompanied by even younger siblings, and they were alone. Sometimes miles from the nearest help. This wasn't a place where danger couldn't reach you. It was a place where, if something did go wrong, you were on your own. The first recorded attack came in 1764. A woman tending cattle was attacked by an unknown animal. And what's interesting isn't just the attack, it's how it happened. Her cattle turned and formed a defensive circle around her. The animal tried to break through them repeatedly, not to attack the livestock, but to get to her. That alone is unusual. Then, on June 30th, 1764, a 14-year-old girl named Jeanne Boulet was killed. Her body was found the next day. And over the following weeks, more attacks followed. At first, people assumed it was a wolf, and that would have made sense. Wolves were present in the region. They were feared. And attacks, particularly on children, did happen. But very quickly, things stopped making sense. Remember, the people in Gévaudan knew wolves. They lived alongside them, they hunted them, and they understood how they behaved. And what they were seeing and hearing didn't match. The victims weren't just very young children. In fact, many were teenagers and adult women. That's already unusual. Then there was the method of attack. Repeatedly, victims were found with severe injuries to the throat. Some had been partially eaten. And in over 15 documented cases, the head had been removed from the body. Not just bitten or mauled, detached completely. cleanly enough that even people at the time who knew wolves questioned it. Now, that's not impossible for a wolf, but it would require significant effort, crushing through bone, tendon, and even severing the spine. And it's not behaviour we typically see, especially not repeated over and over again. There were also details that felt deliberate. Bodies opened at the chest, organs removed, victims dragged considerable distances. This wasn't scavenging, this was targeted, repeated behaviour. There's one case in particular that stands out. A woman named Catherine Varley was attacked in October 1764. Her body was found with the head completely separated. The skull itself was split open, described at the time as if it had been cracked like a nut. And the inside of the skull was cleaned, almost polished as if by a tool. Now, accounts like this are difficult to read, but they matter, because they show a level of force and a pattern of behaviour that people at the time simply didn't associate with wolves. We don't even do that now. Witnesses described something larger than a wolf with a broad chest and powerful front limbs. The creature had a long tail and reddish fur. Most often described by almost all the victims who survived and those who saw the beast was a dark strip running along its back from the neck to the tip of the tail. Some said its head looked almost exactly like a calf's. Others said it moved strangely, not like a dog, more like a cat, low to the ground. One witness described it crawling on its belly like a snake. Then suddenly explosive. Fast, agile, precise. There are even reports of it swatting at people or animals with its paws. None of that is typical wolf behaviour. And here's where it gets interesting. Individually, any one of these descriptions is easy to dismiss. People are scared. Memories are sometimes unreliable. But when you start seeing the same details again and again from different witnesses, you have to at least pause, because something is being described, even if we don't yet understand what it is. By late 1764, the situation had escalated. There had been multiple attacks and deaths. The region was on edge, so authorities responded. Soldiers were brought in. Local people were armed, and large-scale hunts began. And this is where the story shifts, because wolves were being killed regularly, and yet the attacks continued. There are reports of the animal being shot more than once. In one case, it's said to have been hit at least 4 times, knocked down for sure, but then it got back up and ran off. There were blood trails sometimes, but not often, and certainly no body. It just escaped. And it's worth pausing on that, because the weapons being used weren't insignificant. These were flintlock muskets and hunting guns, firing large lead balls up to 6.69 caliber, and often with smaller shot added for good measure. They had enough punch to bring down deer, boar, even wolves in a single shot. These weren't primitive weapons struggling for power. They were effective hunting tools of their time. We know from multiple hunts that wolves in the region were routinely killed with one well-placed shot. In fact, several of the so-called beasts, the ones which were clearly wolves, were indeed killed with one shot. And yet, whatever the beast really was, seemed able to absorb that kind of impact and keep moving. Now again, we have to be careful. These are historical accounts. But even allowing for exaggeration, this is not typical. The beast of Gévaudan was proving again and again it was something difficult to track, difficult to kill, and able to survive encounters that should have stopped it. By early 1765, this had become more than a local problem. King Louis XV himself had become involved, and a large reward was offered for killing of the beast. And that changed everything. Because now, Gévaudan wasn't just dealing with fear, it was dealing with attention. Hunters arrived from across the region, some experienced, some not. Some were looking for answers, whilst others were clearly just looking for money. The man initially tasked with stopping it was Captain Jean-Baptiste Duhamel, a military officer leading groups of dragoons into the countryside. He described the animal as something unlike anything he had encountered, being the size of a young bull, claws like a bear, and a body more like a leopard than a wolf. Later, a local official named Etienne Lafont, who carefully documented many of the attacks, compared it not to a wolf, but to a hyena. Even at the time, people with experience, authority, and familiarity with animals were struggling to categorise what they were dealing with. What we do know is that tens of thousands of people were mobilised in hunts. Imagine that. Entire communities sweeping across mountains and forests trying to find a single animal. And still, it kept killing. And this is the part that often gets lost, because it's easy to focus on the mystery and the history. But at its core, this is a human story. It's not a story to make light of or dismiss as just wolf attacks blown out of proportion. Over 100 people died in horrific, unimaginable ways. There are accounts of children defending each other with makeshift spears, of families fighting to pull loved ones back from the animal, of people putting themselves between the beast and someone smaller, more vulnerable. One of the most well-known incidents involved a group of children who formed a defensive line when the animal attacked. The eldest was just 12 years old, and they chose to protect their younger 8-year-old friends. They were forced to hold their ground and fight and drive off a beast they didn't recognise. That tells you something important. This wasn't just fear. This was resilience. People adapting to something they didn't fully understand. Around this time, something else begins to happen. The story starts to change. Not the events themselves, but how they're interpreted. Newspapers begin reporting on the beast, and the church references it, and gradually the idea of the beast becomes something bigger. Not just an animal, but a symbol, a warning, a punishment, a manifestation of fear. Some modern historians, like J.M. Smith, argue that what we're seeing here is the creation of a narrative, that the beast, as we understand it today, was simply shaped by journalism, religion, and the cultural anxiety of the time. In other words, the beast may not have been a single creature at all, but a story built on real events. And in some ways, that is a compelling argument. But I don't think it explains everything. The reason I don't think it explains everything is because even if we strip away the myth, we're still left with the behaviour. And this is where things get difficult. Wolves do attack humans. They absolutely do. It's true. But when you look at the numbers, things start to fall apart. Across Europe, from the 1700s onwards, wolf attacks did happen, but they were relatively rare. On average, around 5 fatal attacks per year across the entire continent between 1700 and 1900. In Gévaudan alone, we're looking at somewhere between 78 and nearly 100 deaths in just 3 years. That's not a local spike, that's a major anomaly. Not just unusually statistical, but difficult to explain. And then there's the targeting. Wolves typically go for the most vulnerable, young children, often under the age of 9. In Gévaudan, over half the victims were between 10 and 18. This was a group that would be stronger, faster, harder to overpower. That's a very different risk profile, but it's also the perfect middle ground. Imagine it from the point of view of a large predator. Small children might be easy prey, but they don't offer the calorific reward that will fuel you unless you make regular and numerous kills. Men, on the other hand, are large, perhaps too large, and when evaluated defensively, they're too likely to put up a sustained fight where you might lose your edge. But youths and women, that's the most viable target. They're the Goldilocks scenario in this instance. Besides that, the animal showed a level of strength and behaviour that doesn't really fit what we know about wolves. Even at the time, people who knew wolves weren't convinced. For instance, there's another detail that often gets overlooked. The beast didn't just attack, it adapted. When hunting pressure increased in one area, it moved. When kills were disturbed, it became faster, more efficient. There are even patterns suggesting it began changing its behaviour over time, targeting differently, moving differently, surviving differently. That's not random, that's something learning. And it's exactly what another group of famous man-eaters did, which we'll explore more in part 2. Ultimately, by the end of 1765, dozens of people were dead, and many wolves had been killed. Hunts had failed, and even the king had intervened. And still, something was out there. Not just surviving, but adapting, learning, and becoming harder to understand with every passing month. Because the real question wasn't just how to stop it anymore. It was something far more unsettling. If it wasn't a wolf, then what was it? If you enjoy these kinds of stories, there's more on the channel and on the blog itself. In part 2, we'll look at the theories and the potential candidates that do fit this story. Not just wolves, but hyenas, big cats, and the possibility that something far more unusual found its way into Gévaudan. As always, thank you for listening and thank you for watching.